We're here today with Nick Sundquist. He's a candidate for 91st House of Representatives in the state of Michigan, running on the Libertarian Party. Nick, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running for state rep.
Well, I thank you very much for having me today. About myself, there's not really an awful lot interesting to say. I'm not just a regular guy doing a regular job. I'm self-employed. Take dents out of cars. The reason I'm running is on account of I get tired of yelling at my television and radio and newspaper and think that the people of Michigan in the 91st District need a legitimate difference. You know, the other two candidates are basically the same. There's not really a whole lot of difference between them.
What's the difference between the Libertarian Party's philosophy and the Republican and Democrat Party philosophies?
I think the Republican and Democrat Party philosophies are fundamentally the same. The idea that you can take money from some people and give it to other people. Libertarian Party, I guess look at it like this. The Democrats say they want to steal from the rich, and the Republicans say they want to steal from the poor. They don't say those things outright, but if you listen to the rhetoric of the other side, Libertarians just want to outlaw stealing. And that's the basic difference. I think if you read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, you'd have a good understanding of libertarian philosophy.
What do you see the biggest problems with as far as the state of Michigan government today?
The biggest problem is that we have too much of it. If you go to michiganvotes.org, spell out the whole word Michigan, and look at the 21 bills that Holly Hughes introduced, you'll discover that first time you look through them, you say to yourself, oh, okay, that's reasonable, and why not, and wouldn't hurt. And then you scratch your head and say, wait a minute, do we really need to have a resolution to have a thing called Plant a Flower Day? You know, in a free country, we have to have a law that says you can let dogs in outdoor cafes. Just senseless, meaningless things like that. And we need a part-time legislature is what we need. Here's a little fact for your audience. The state of Texas gets along on a 6% sales tax. They don't have a full-time legislature. They don't have an income tax. They don't have a corporate tax. They don't have silly signs that say this is a cool city, and they don't have a 15% unemployment rate. We get too many people in Lansing doing silly things, frankly.
Michigan had a policy for a number of years where the license fee you paid for your license plates were based on the weight of your car. And then in the mid-'80s, they changed it to having it based on the value of the car. And now what we have is situations where you get cars on the road that are 10, 15 years old, and at the time they were purchased, they were quite expensive, but obviously now they're not worth that much at all. And unfortunately, people are having to pay over the course of a year or two the value of their car in license plate fees just to keep it on the road. What do you think should be done about that? I think there should be legislation introduced that where we have a sliding scale to where the plate fees decrease as the years go on, or what's the solution to that problem?
I sometimes wonder why I've got to have a license plate at all. Really, when you get right down to it, with a license plate, if somebody stole your car, the idea that there's going to be a policeman out there that's going to be looking for that license plate or anything else is kind of silly. And the idea that the thief's not smart enough to put a different license plate on it after, if he's going to keep driving, he's going to scrap the thing anyway. Your license plate doesn't do you any good. Why do we got to pay for it? If it's for the police to monitor me, then they ought to run it. They ought to have just a simple gas tax to pay for the roads, and then they ought to use that money to pay for the roads. And all this other quibbling fees and fines and all the rest of it, they just don't need if they'd manage the budget properly.
What taxes would you cut first?
I'd cut the income tax and the corporate income tax, and cut enough government to pay for that. Here's an interesting idea, and a lot of people are going to call me a raving lunatic. They want to kill people on the job and all that, I suspect. But what do you think that the Department of Occupational Health and Safety actually does for us? I submit to you and your audience that it is a tax collecting agency and nothing else. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Hope that works. It's a tax collecting agency. The idea that your employer is indifferent to your safety is preposterous. Even if he doesn't know your name, he doesn't want to you to fall down and hurt yourself on the job. He loses production for that day. He's got to train a new employee. You've caused him all kinds of problems, even if he doesn't care a whit about you. Or that the idea that you're just not smart enough to know that you're working in unsafe conditions. It's sort of insulting, isn't it? Now, here's another one for you. In a big factory, an employer has insurance. They have insurance, and so the insurance companies don't want to pay claims. They hire what they call stop loss experts to go through those factories and other workplaces to make sure that they're safe. Who do you trust to do the job? Somebody that's going to have to pay a fine or a fee or a claim on an insurance policy, or a guy who's out there trying to maximize fines? It's interesting to me that only the big factories, the ones that can afford to pay the big fines, are ever visited. You know, the smaller operations that might be dangerous, nobody ever bothers them because they can't afford to pay the fines. It's a silly idea to think that we need Michigan OSHA. And there's all kinds of other examples. Most of government is involved in tax collecting. You know, your barber has to go to school and be licensed to do something that, frankly, you could learn to do yourself in a few minutes at home. My wife cuts my hair. It's a reasonably nice haircut. Don't tell anybody now because I'm sure it's against the law. Most of what government does is just completely unnecessary. We just don't need it.
We've had situations in the Michigan Supreme Court, and to a lesser extent in the lower court races, where it gets extremely political and extremely, I'll say, driven by special interest groups. And the judges that get elected are essentially not independent like they should be, and like for many years they used to be. What would your solution be to that problem?
I suspect strongly that you need to change the culture. And one way to help change that culture, I think, is to pass a law in Michigan that all juries need to be fully informed of their rights to judge not only the facts of a particular case, but to judge the law itself as well. And it's my understanding that many members of the Tea Party are Christian people, and that they wouldn't necessarily be all that concerned about drug users. And people go to jail for selling drugs and all the rest. Now, stop and think about this. In the process of voir dire, most anybody that would ever be sympathetic to that drug user or seller is going to be stricken from the jury. And so the judge is going to tell the jury that they need to basically convict the guy because the undercover officer sold him the drugs or bought it from him or whatever it is. And so basically it's just a show trial. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, I don't care about drugs, I don't use them, and none of that matters to me. They're grinding up whole neighborhoods. And nobody's benefiting except the judges and the public defenders and the police departments. They all have plenty of work to do. And the taxpayers are on the hook for the prisons where 60% of them are in there for nonviolent drug crimes. Now, that's one issue. You may still be indifferent to it. Your audience may still be indifferent to it. I don't know how anybody can be indifferent to the colossal waste this is, but just the same. For a Christian audience, I want you to imagine this. Representative Brown has a bill in the state legislature that would force pharmacists to carry RU-486 and make it available to any comers. And now, imagine you're a pharmacist and you're on trial for refusing some little girl. Say, just bring your mother back in here and we'll get you what you need. Then your clever lawyer says, well, just tell them you're Christian. We'll get you off from this. It's a religious exemption. Now, anybody that might be sympathetic to you, a pharmacist, is going to be stricken from your jury. Now, these are serious issues. The jury is the last line of defense against tyrannical government. That's the reason it's designed. The title's a little bit embarrassing, but I encourage anybody to read a book called Send in the Waco Killers by a fellow named Vin Supernowitz. He's very eloquent on the subject. And that would be sort of a long-winded way of saying the citizens need to be involved in the courts. That would, I think, would help address the issue you mentioned.
Marijuana, it's recently been legalized for medical purposes. Should marijuana be decriminalized in general so we don't have people sitting in jail for possession of it and use of it?
Well, absolutely, number one. Number two, it ought to just be legal. And people are going to call me a crazy man after years and years of propaganda on this subject. They believe that there's all kinds of dangers and the rest of it. Listen, if it was legal, you could go and buy it from your pharmacist, and he'd make a profit on it. The government would regulate the quality, purity standards of these things so you wouldn't have little kids getting overdoses. And secondly, it would be an awful lot more difficult for your children to get a hold of it. You ask any high school kid you think will give you an honest answer, and he will tell you that it's easier to get illegal drugs than it is to buy a bottle of beer. And I just think it's irrefutable, and it's silly to have this locking up people for smoking pot or taking drugs. If you read any old Russian novels, you'll discover that there's always an old woman in there who's on laudanum. It's heroin, ladies and gentlemen. It's heroin. And the idea that all kinds of people are going to go out and start taking drugs if they're legal, frankly, I think fewer people would. You know, take the subculture away, and all of a sudden you've got a lot less people. They're not hanging around in the schoolyards trying to get your kids hooked on the stuff. Your pharmacist doesn't want to sell that to your kids. He's got a reputation to uphold in the neighborhood. It's a crazy idea, the amount of money and energy and ruined lives we have in this country over a failed drug policy.
We've got two houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and then the Senate. And there's 110 state reps and 38 senators. Should we have more or less in each house? And should there be two houses? Is one house good enough, unicameral? Or
I don't know why we have a state senate. Frankly, I don't know why we have a full-time legislature. There's only 4 states in the union that have a full-time legislature. If I'm elected, that's going to be the first thing that I'll introduce. I don't expect the people over there to vote themselves out of a job, but I think that Representative Dave Agema has put a bill in. Frankly, I think we could afford to pay the legislatures more if we could just send them home. You know, we'd have a lot less cost involved in all of these things. You know, in the U.S. Congress, you have the Senate and the Congress, and the Senate represents the interest of the individual states. I don't know how they set up the Senate districts in Michigan. There's no governmental units that they're representing. I think we could at least do away with the Senate. And insofar as representatives go, I don't know more or less whether it makes a whole lot of difference. Really, with Republicans and Democrats, they're in there spending all of your money, and the idea that they're, you know, huge partisanship and all the rest of that's kind of silly too. Really, the only difference between them is whose friends get to loot.
There's essentially, if somebody's an attorney, meaning a member of the State Bar Association, they are governed by the Attorney Discipline Board, Attorney Grievance Commission, and they're also officers of the court. So essentially, they're a part of the judicial branch of government, albeit somewhat indirectly. Should attorneys be allowed to run for state rep and state senate and governor?
That's an interesting question, something I haven't considered. Phrased like that, probably not. I'm not in. I'm not something I just haven't considered. I'll have to consider that and get back to you. I think that the idea that attorneys are officers of the court, frankly, is a little bit frightening. I mean, I think that they should be allowed to have a trade association if they want, but the idea that no one can practice law in Michigan without being an attorney is a little irksome to me. I think that legal expenses would go down. Imagine that you're a landlord and you own a whole bunch of houses in town, and you get pretty good at evicting people if you're going to do that. And somebody says to you, golly, I'd give you $100 if you walk me through the paperwork on how to evict somebody. Why shouldn't you be able to? And if you've spent a lot of time in jail and know how to get out of jail, why shouldn't you be able to sell your services to somebody else? And, if you're any good at it. People say, well, there's no standards. Well, in the absence of government standards, the private market would create those. Underwriters Laboratory is a perfect example of this. The Realtor Association is another example of it. They set standards all their members have to follow. I can give you any consumer reports. You know, this is a non-governmental organization and everybody's familiar with Ralph Nader and the consumer reports. We just don't need all the government hoops to go through.
We've got a situation in the state where there's several cities, and they're larger ones, and they have serious financial problems, and it's been something that's been going on now for a number of years. What are we going to go ahead and do to have these cities get their budgets balanced?
I think that the cities ought to just go bankrupt. I think that the emergency manager law, that, you know, we can keep these places going with the same silly underlying structure that they have. If the economy turns around, maybe they can keep doing silly things. The reason that they're having financial problems is because they're mismanaged. If they're bankrupt, you know, you get maybe they ought to have a law that says nobody that's in there running the system now can run again for 10 years or something like that. But, you know, the idea that the rest of the taxpayers have to foot the bill for Muskegon Heights High School, which is horribly mismanaged for so many years that it's frankly preposterous. Or the city of Flint. People ought to have a little self-respect and get their house in order. It's sacred trust to be elected to office, not a giveaway to unions. Thanks.
Michigan's prison system, it's pretty large. I think it's one of the largest things on the budget. And as you said earlier, there's quite a few people in there that have been convicted of nonviolent crimes, drug possession, not paying child support, things that the people in there are not clear and present dangers to the community. Should we have a reform of criminal sentencing so that the people that are not a clear and present danger to society and end up not going to prison, not even being eligible for prison, so that the judge can't be tempted to send them there because it's not an option?
Absolutely. There is no good reason that I can think of to keep people in prison for drug crimes or victimless crimes of any sort. It's morally wrong. And again, the only people that are benefiting are the judges and the policemen and the public defenders. They all have job security. It's just wrong, and the taxpayers have to foot the bill for it. It's crazy to take productive people out of society, or the idea, you know, you're going to pay your child support in jail. Are they, you know, how much money do you make in jail? I don't think you don't have a chance to get a job. You've just made it a lot more difficult to get a job for a fellow with a jail record. It's irrational. Yeah, we need to reform an awful lot of that.
Michigan, Great Lakes state, and we have 1/5 of the world's fresh water supply, right almost in walking distance, definitely walking distance for Muskegon people. What can we do to ensure that stays clean and pure and fresh and does not get diverted to other areas?
Well, I think that if you're asking about environmental regulations, and this is going to sound almost paradoxical, but I think that the Department of Environmental Quality ought to be abolished. I don't think that they actually save us from pollution. I think that the courts are where precedent needs to be set in environmental cases. I think that if you can prove that somebody's hurt you with their factory or something like that, then you take them to court and win your case. And then that factory remedies your hurt, the factory owners, and they don't engage in whatever sort of behavior that caused your hurt in the future. If you can prove that somebody's doing something to harm your lakefront property, or a municipality wants to take a suit against some other person because of some economic harm that's occurred, they ought to be able to do it. I don't think that environmental laws are actually serve to keep pollution at a set level. They're not doing anything to reduce pollution, and they're doing an awful lot to harm job creation in Michigan. There's I think it's Hart Industries in Sparta I'm not sure how the case is going now. I haven't checked up on it, but they were being harassed by the Department of Environmental Quality because they get a mud puddle in the back of their lot. The man bought property in an industrial park, and he paved part of it. Business is pretty good. He's making medical devices, so he doesn't want the employees tracking mud in. He wanted to hire 50 new employees. I think he's still in court with the Department of Environmental Quality rather than paving his lot to hire the 50 new employees. If you do just a little bit of research on the Greenville Electrolux story, you'll discover that they've been being harassed by the Department of Environmental Quality for what amounts to paperwork, clerical error. $3,000 a day retroactively. The state of Michigan and the union in that particular case were going to give those people $750 million in concessions from the union, and the state was going to buy them a new factory or some other crazy thing. They still packed up and went to Mexico. Now stop and think about this for a minute. $750 million is a lot of money. And you're going to have to ship your refrigerators to your customers in the United States from Mexico. So even if the labor's a lot less expensive, your costs aren't really going down that much. $750 million, you got to sell a lot of refrigerators to make that kind of loot. And still, they left. I think you can find cases where if you look just a little bit, you'll find cases where the DEQ is just harassing businesses. That's the problem with Michigan altogether, really, when you get right down to it. Business people are treated like they're criminals before they even open up their businesses. Anyway, there I said it. And as far as diversion, water diversion, I don't want to try and skip around your question. What about an excise tax? The water's being diverted anyway. If you had an excise tax on it, you'd know how much was going and you'd be able to regulate how much went. You'd have some more money for the state budget. Just an idea, something to think about.
Michigan is a tourist state in the summertime. We have a lot of people that this is their destination. They love coming here, and they've done it for years. What can we do to get some of these tourists to move here year-round? What would make this state attractive to them?
Well, I think I've already mentioned a couple of things that would make the state attractive to them. Less regulation. Republicans are always going on about, they're going to lower regulations, but I have yet to see any specific proposal to reduce regulations on businesses. If the economy were better in Michigan, people would want to stay here. If you come here on vacation and you say, God, I'd like to live there all the time, it would be wonderful. But the nature of the question troubles me just a little bit. I don't think it's government's business to encourage or discourage anything. If you're robbing your neighbor, it's your government's job to lock you up. But outside of committing crimes, the government ought to just leave people alone. And it's interesting to me that under those conditions, we have a steady, simple, easy to bear tax burden, and the legislature's not writing new laws to change the rules every other day, then people want to live there. Before, in this country, simple, steady rules, the rule of law, is what caused the economy to grow so rapidly by comparison to our European neighbors. And that's what needs to be done. The idea that the Michigan government, we got two different agencies that are just, spending taxpayer dollars to get new companies to come here. A lot of people don't know this is actually just injustice. It's plain old-fashioned corruption. You've got Jay's Sporting Goods in Clare, and they've got another big store in Gladwin, is my understanding. They pay taxes in the state of Michigan. Some of the money that they pay in taxes is going to encourage Cabela's, their main competitor, to come to Michigan. That's simply unjust. We get the governor made some news recently by lowering the amount that we're going to give to the film companies. We want the film companies to come in, and I haven't any idea why. The idea that you can take money from some people and skim off a bunch of it for overhead and then give it to other people and get a net economic gain, it's irrational and it's wrong. It's morally wrong to do this. And the government shouldn't be involved in it.
Well, basically then you're saying the taxes should just be cut across the board for everybody, and don't pick winners or losers, let the marketplace decide that.
Absolutely. Again, the state of Texas gets along on a 6% sales tax. They don't have a corporate tax. They don't have a personal income tax. They do have an excise tax on some of the oil that they sell, so they have an advantage there. But 6% sales tax, and that's it. The roads aren't crumbling in Texas. And businesses know what to expect. And so it's easy to do business there, and so businesses do. Here's an interesting thing. Stop and think about this for just a minute. People say we're losing jobs to China. It's preposterous. The number of manufacturing jobs relative to the population is declining everywhere on the planet. Everywhere. The interesting thing is that there are more people employed in the United States today making automobiles than ever before in our history. There are 8 foreign automakers that make cars in the United States in just the last 30 years, built new factories. Now, how come none of them built their plants in Michigan? We've got all the engineering talent, we've got manufacturing culture, we've got fresh water, we've got all the raw materials and talent and workforce and everything you need, and access to markets. We're situated quite nicely to get to all the major markets. People buy and drive cars here in Michigan. Why? It's because Michigan's government is dysfunctional. That's why they're not here. They don't want to deal with Michigan OSHA. They don't want to deal with the DEQ. They don't want to deal with the silly union work rules. People say, well, I guess maybe I'll wait till you ask the question if you're going to about unions, that kind of thing.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't think we need a right to work law. I think we need to have a freedom of contract law. If you own a factory and you want to deal exclusively with a union, you ought to be able to. You know, there's no way that you should say that certain employees don't have to join. If you have a contract with that union, they're going to supply you with labor, and you like the fact that you don't have to worry about different rules and regulations because it's on the union to take care of those other situations. More power to you. But nobody should be forced to deal with a union just because the majority of the employees think that they ought to. It doesn't make any sense to me. If you work your whole life, imagine you spend 12-hour days for years and years and years to make and market a product that you're proud of, and now your employees say that they know better how to run your business than you do. Again, it's just immoral, and nobody should be forced to deal with that. I mean, other than by market forces. You know, if you may have to whether you want to or not, and that's perfectly reasonable.
Public school system in Michigan, is it broke or is it working good? What's your read on that?
I think the public school system should be abolished. I think that we need to have separation of school and state for the same reason that we have separation of church and state. I think that in the interim, we need to start, ideally, you'd have a completely capitalist system where people paid for the schools that they wanted to out of their own pockets, and people could afford to if they weren't taxed to pay for this ridiculous public school. But in the interim, you could give every kid in the state a $7,000 voucher, and you'd have better outcomes educationally. The state of Michigan spends just under $13,000 per student per year, every single year. And 87% of the Muskegon Chronicle published recently, 87% of the kids aren't ready to go to college when they graduate. Which means that after 13 years of instruction, they haven't been taught to read or write or do basic arithmetic. McDonald's has pictures on the keyboard because they can't trust the kids to do basic math. Stop and think about this. That's why they put the little pictures on the keyboard at McDonald's. It's completely broken. And then, if you've got a special needs child, you know, cognitive impaired or you know, physical disability, if you had a voucher, schools different schools would be available for the specific needs of your child. You wouldn't have to argue with the school board or the state legislature to get your child into a program that was designed to help, and you'd cut about a quarter of the state budget if you just give every parent a voucher for their students for $7,000. Muskegon Catholic Central, 90% of their students go on to college, and their highest tuition is only $6,500, and it goes down by $1,000 each for middle and grade schools. And I think they'll give you a $1,000 discount if you're a member of the parish. Now, I don't say this to advocate for Catholic Central or religious schools in particular, or to criticize teachers in public schools, but to demonstrate that the administration of the public school system in Michigan is just horrid. It's abominable. Mona Shores had an article in the paper a couple of days back where they said that the budget was so tight that they were going to have to lay off the operations director and his 2 assistants. Now, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, what were the principals and the various principals and superintendent doing? Why weren't they operating, directing the operations? Yeah, we need to have some fundamental reform in the schools in Michigan.
What do we do about special interest groups, political action committees, and basically those that, I'll call them gangs for want of a better word, that attempt to disproportionately influence government?
Well, I don't think, you're right to characterize them as gangs, I think. But I don't think that special interest really is the problem. And you've got NRA and you Save the Whales and whatever other groups. Those are you and me. $20 for a membership and all the rest of it. It's the citizens trying to influence the legislature. The problem, as I see it, isn't the people trying to influence. That's only right and just that people are trying to influence. It's the amount of power that the legislature has. If you would take away that power and say, you guys, you don't have any right to regulate these things, to put your competition out of business, or to do favors for one group at the expense of another. If the legislature didn't have that power, no one would care who was in there. You'd eliminate the corruption, because the market would decide who gets your money. You have a vote for everything that you spend $1 on. You've got to vote for it, and I think that that's the better way to do it. You eliminate all the corruption. On a related topic, I have to say that we really need to do away with all the campaign finance laws as well. Get rid of them. People say, well, we have to know who's getting the loot. We have to know why they're trying to influence the legislature. Aren't we smart enough to figure out who's doing what to whom without knowing? And as a libertarian, I got to tell you, it's difficult to raise money, because I'm not promising special interest that I'm going to write legislation favoring them over their competition. And so, libertarians all over have the very same problems. But there are Republicans in this race that are so dissatisfied with Mrs. Hughes that they would give me money, except for they don't want to have their names on the list of donors, because it would embarrass them in the Republican Party. Now, it's just wrong. We have a secret ballot in this country for a reason, and the reason the ballot is secret is so that you don't have to fear reprisal from the winner if your candidate loses. That's why the corporations, generally speaking, give almost equally to both parties. Don't pester us. We're giving you money. Just go away. It's a protection racket when you get right down to it. Anyway, I'm sorry to ramble on like that.
That's fine. That's the purpose of the interview. We have a ballot proposal statewide that essentially was put there by a gentleman that owns the Ambassador Bridge, and what he wants to do is try to maneuver the law in his favor so that the governor cannot make deals with Canada to build a public bridge. He wants to be the one that builds it privately and obviously make some money off it. Now, well, there shouldn't be any problem with somebody trying to turn a profit. Isn't it wrong to go ahead and take that type of proposal and raise it to a constitutional question over what the government can do regarding the building of bridges in the state?
On principle, yeah, none of those proposals belong, as constitutional amendments. None of them rise to the level of constitutional amendment, except for maybe the 2/3. I'm not a constitutional scholar, and so I don't really have a strong feeling one way or another, but none of them seem like they rise to the level of constitutional amendment. On the other hand, the legislature already said no, they didn't want the bridge. They didn't want to pay for the bridge. We don't have enough money to pay for a bridge. And so then the governor did an end run around. He said, well, if the Canadians are paying for it and you can't bother with it. But the Canadians aren't going to pay for it. I mean, they might, but they're going to be the ones collecting the tolls for the future and all the rest of it. I think if Mr. Maroon wants to build another bridge, they ought to let him build another bridge. If there's enough traffic to bear, somebody else would build the darn thing. There are companies out there that are in the business of building interstate highways and bridges for the right to collect the tolls. If there's enough traffic, somebody will build a bridge. We don't need to make any deals with the Canadians.
What about some of these other ballot proposals that are on there? There's one on there that states that home health care workers are guaranteed to senior citizens, and the other one on there saying that something to do with collective bargaining for unions, essentially. Then one on there saying about raising taxes. It has to be a 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House. Then there's an emergency manager law that's on there. What's your read on those? Are those things that really the ones that are the ones that want to amend the Constitution? Is that what the Constitution should be amended for? Is that what it's all about, or shouldn't these things stay in the legislature?
Yeah, as I said before, I don't think that any of them rise to the level of constitutional amendment. The Constitution is supposed to give you a basic framework for how the government is structured, and none of those, they're all entirely too specific to say that they need to be in the Constitution. The home health care bill is really a crime. This is in response to the legislature and the governor finally signing off and saying that the unions didn't have a right to collect union dues from people that they called employees. The state's giving a stipend. Now, you can argue whether or not it's right and just for the state to give people a stipend to take care of their own relatives at home. That's a separate argument. But the idea that these people are now government employees because they're getting a check from the government to take care of their sick relatives at home and are therefore subject to union dues, it's a little bit frightening. The blatant, I hardly think of the word. The idea that they're collecting union dues. This started out with the daycare providers. Maybe somebody in the neighborhood where you live, where one of the women is got a little sign in her yard and she's taking care of the neighborhood kids because the other mothers have to go to work to pay the taxes. And then the state pays some women to send their kids to school so they can go out looking for jobs and get a job. Now those women, I think, that were running the daycares, finally they got their union dues. They quit collecting those. But the home health care aides, this is a money laundering scheme for the Democrat Party. The SEIU is a big donor to the Democrat Party, and it needs to stop. And there certainly shouldn't be. If it passes, it's a frightening thought to me. And the idea that collective bargaining is enshrined in the Constitution, again. Let's have freedom of contract in a free republic, and not dictate to people what sort of financial arrangements and agreements that they can make. Yeah, they shouldn't. None of those should be in the Constitution.
When they have debates, they always schedule them for Republican and Democrat candidates, and rarely, if ever, do any third-party candidates get invited to these debates, whether they're held in a public school, whether they're sponsored by government, whether they're sponsored by the private sector, public TV. Should there be some type of requirement that that all the candidates should be automatically invited to any type of debate in a public forum rather than a private forum?
That's sort of a troubling question. It's sort of a troubling question. To the extent that government is sponsoring the debate, yeah, any legitimate candidate ought to be involved. Most debates are sponsored by private organizations, and I think that they have a right to invite whomever they choose to invite. But it really is troubling. Recently, Gary Johnson was removed from the ballot in Michigan, They took him off the ballot in Michigan and Oklahoma. And it's political shenanigans, really. The League of Women Voters used to have a rule when they were sponsoring the presidential debates many years ago, that any candidate that was on the ballot in enough states to have a mathematical chance of winning would be invited. And Harry Brown was on the ballot in all 50 states in 2006, I believe. They changed the rule. And they said any candidate that we think has a realistic chance of winning, from objective to subjective. It's just wrong. We had a candidate, and I want to say it's the 74th district. James Lewis is running for state house or on the other side of the state. They invited him to the event and then disinvited him. Well, it's one thing to say, oh, we don't think you're a serious candidate, you're not invited. But it's another thing to say, well, one of our candidates doesn't, want to be embarrassed by the questions you might ask him, so we're not going to have you. I don't know. I think just basic human decency requires that people be given an opportunity to hear all the candidates. To the extent that they're being covered by news organizations. Listen, when they let Ross Perot into the debates, people say, well, he doesn't have a chance to win. There's no point in inviting him. But if they let Ross Perot into the debates, what happened? He started polling at about 3%. Nobody outside Texas knew who he was. And he got in the debates, and even after dropping out of the race and getting back in, and not really having very many good ideas, I think he had all the worst ideas of both parties, but he just spoke plain English, and people respected him for that, for just speaking his mind out loud and in a comprehensible way. And I think he got nearly 20% of the vote. If he'd been a good quality candidate, he might have won. Stop and think about that. People need to be exposed to these ideas before they get out. And again, Gary Johnson's been excluded from virtually all press coverage, and in some states he's still polling at 10%. The way they treated Ron Paul is absolutely wrong. He should have been speaking at the Republican convention. I suspect strongly that he won in Iowa. The idea that Mitt Romney won in Iowa back then is frankly preposterous. And they called a snow day in Maine, to keep him from winning I think he probably won in Maine too. And they miscounted the votes. And in Iowa, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he miscounted the votes. Was it Mitt Romney or was it Santorum? Neither one of them were in the upper tier of the straw poll. It's difficult for me to believe that people felt one way the week before and then suddenly changed their votes, the very next week. Doesn't make any sense. So what's the answer? I don't know. I think people would sell more newspapers if they try to generate more controversy. It's interesting, isn't it? Something's going on. I don't know what the answer to that question is.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Vote your conscience. In this particular race, really, there's no difference between the two other candidates, not fundamentally. Please, you can go to nicksundquist.com. There's a D in the middle of Sundquist. There's a candidate comparison. Holly Hughes has a record to run on. You can see all the bills that she introduced on the one side and what I think of them on the other. And there's a link to MichiganVotes.org where you can look at the actual bills yourself and see what you think about them. And Colleen Lamonti is a garden variety Democrat. There's nothing to make you believe that she would act any differently than any of the other garden variety Democrats in the state house. So in this case, just vote your conscience. It doesn't make any difference one way or the other. I thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking some time with us to spend the day on the interview. Good luck.
Thanks.